This man disappears after swimming in this cave, but 3 years later the police find him. Mark had always felt at home in the water. He was an experienced diver, someone who thrived on the feeling of weightlessness and the allure of the unexplored. For years, he had swum in protected areas, documenting marine life and sharing his findings with a small but dedicated online following. But his curiosity, which had served him well in the past, would soon lead him into the depths of a nightmare he could never have imagined. It started with whispers. Local divers spoke of a cave hidden within a remote cove off limits, dangerous and surrounded by a shroud of mystery. Rumors abounded, stories of strong currents, disorienting passages, and most chillingly, people who had entered and never returned. The locals called it the Abyss of Echoes, named for the strange sounds that reportedly emanated from its depths, like distant voices calling out. Mark's friends begged him not to go. Some places are off limits for a reason, his best friend Lucas had said. But Mark's curiosity was insatiable. He was convinced the stories were exaggerated, the dangers overstated. So on a cloudy afternoon, armed with his gear and his determination, Mark drove to the secluded spot and prepared for the dive of his life. The water was unusually cold that day, the waves sluggish as if warning him to turn back, but Mark pressed on. He found the cave mouth easily enough, a jagged black opening just beneath the surface. As he slipped inside, the world grew darker, quieter. The only sounds were the steady rhythm of his breathing and the occasional rush of bubbles escaping his regulator. The cave was vast, far larger than he had anticipated. Its walls shimmered faintly, reflecting the beam of his flashlight in strange, hypnotic patterns. As he ventured deeper, he noticed something odd. The water here felt thicker, almost viscous. His movements grew sluggish, his limbs heavy, and then came the voices. At first, they were faint and soft, melodic hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. But as he swam further, they grew louder, more distinct. Words he couldn't understand, overlapping, echoing, filling the space until it felt like they were inside his head. Mark tried to turn back, but he couldn't tell which way he had come. The walls of the cave seemed to shift around him, the passages warping and narrowing, trapping him in a labyrinth of stone and water. Then, the light from his flashlight dimmed and finally flickered out. In the pitch-black void, the voices grew deafening. Mark's last coherent memory was of something moving in the water shape, massive and serpentine, with eyes that glowed like molten gold. It surged toward him, and then nothing. 3 years passed. Mark's disappearance became a local legend, a cautionary tale for divers. His parents mourned him, his friends blamed themselves, and the world moved on. But one rainy night, Mark's mother received a phone call from the police. "We found him," the officer said, his voice trembling. "But you need to prepare yourself. He's changed." They found him wandering a beach over 100 miles from the cave, his body emaciated and covered in strange scars that glowed faintly in the dark. His eyes, once warm and brown, were now a piercing, inhuman gold. He didn't speak at first, just stared into the distance, mumbling words in a language no one could understand. When he finally did tell his story, it was incoherent, fragmented, a mix of terror and awe. Mark claimed he had been taken to another place, a realm beyond the cave where time and reality worked differently. He spoke of creatures older than the earth, beings made of light and shadow, who had shown him things no human was meant to see. He called them the Echoes, and he said they lived in the spaces between worlds, feeding on the curiosity of those who ventured too far. "I'm not the same," he told his parents, his voice hollow. "They changed me, they're still inside me." Mark's return was just the beginning. Strange phenomena began to follow him, lights flickering, water boiling without heat, whispers that seemed to come from the air itself. Doctors and scientists tried to study him, but their instruments often malfunctioned in his presence. And then there was the chilling fact that anyone who spent too much time near him started hearing the voices to ... The last anyone heard of Mark, he had vanished again, leaving behind a cryptic note. The locals still avoid the cave, now more than ever. But sometimes, on still nights, divers claim to hear faint whispers coming from its depths. And those who listen too long say they feel an overwhelming urge to dive in, as if something is calling them ... just like it called Mark. When Mark disappeared the second time, no one expected him to return. His parents resigned themselves to the unthinkable, unwilling to believe he was still alive. Scientists who had briefly studied him speculated that his transformation, both physical and psychological, was irreversible, a product of trauma or perhaps exposure to something far beyond human understanding. But the whispers of his story spread, becoming more than legend. Divers, thrill seekers, and conspiracy theorists began traveling to the cove, hoping to glimpse the cave where Mark's ordeal began. What no one anticipated was the aftermath. A year after Mark's second disappearance, strange events began happening along the coastline. Fishermen reported entire schools of fish swimming in perfect, unnatural formations, as though choreographed by an unseen force. Sailors spoke of the sea glowing faintly at night, the light pulsing in time with their heartbeats. And then, the disappearances began again, not just divers, but beachgoers, campers, and even a marine biologist studying the waters. Some said they heard voices before vanishing, a faint, melodic hum that grew louder the closer they came to the water. Others left behind strange, scrawled notes and incomprehensible symbols. The authorities closed the cove and issued warnings, but it didn't stop people from coming. The mystery was too alluring. Then came the first real clue. A young woman named Elena, an experienced diver who had narrowly escaped the cave years earlier, claimed she had seen Mark after his second disappearance. She told her story to a small group of researchers, her voice shaking with the weight of what she had experienced. Elena had been diving miles away from the infamous cave, exploring an uncharted reef, when she felt it, a cold, suffocating sensation, like the water itself was alive. The voices began softly, like a current brushing against her ears, and then grew louder, more insistent. "Come," they whispered, "see." She felt herself pulled toward the darkness, and that's when she saw him, Mark, or what was left of him. He was standing at the edge of the reef, underwater, but he wasn't drowning. His body moved with an unnatural fluidity, his limbs too long, his skin shimmering faintly in the dim light. His golden eyes locked onto hers, and he smiled a slow, eerie smile that sent chills through her entire body. "Elena," he said, his voice reverberating through the water as if carried by the current itself, "you shouldn't be here." Before she could respond, he raised his hand and the water around her turned thick, almost solid, pressing in on her chest. She blacked out and woke up on the surface, gasping for air. Mark was gone. Her story was dismissed as hysteria by most, but those who had seen the glowing waters and heard the whispers believed her. Weeks after Elena's encounter, the whispers began spreading inland. People living miles from the coast reported hearing faint voices in their homes, particularly at night. Pools, fountains, even puddles began to shimmer faintly with the same golden light that had radiated from Mark's eyes. Researchers finally convinced the government to launch an expedition into the cave. The team included divers, scientists, and advanced sonar equipment, but what they found defied explanation. The cave had changed. Its interior was far larger than it should have been, with chambers that seemed to stretch for miles. Strange, bioluminescent patterns lined the walls, pulsating like the heartbeat of some colossal creature. The deeper they ventured, the more distorted reality became. Their instruments malfunctioned, time seemed to stretch and compress, and some team members reported hearing their own voices calling to them from the darkness. Only one member of the team made it back. His hair had turned stark white, and his skin was marked with the same glowing scars as Mark's. "They're waking up," he whispered before collapsing. As the phenomenon spread, the government imposed strict quarantines on the area, but it was too late. The Echoes had found a way out, using Mark as their herald. Sightings of him became more frequent on remote beaches, near rivers, even in the midst of urban fountains. Wherever he appeared, the water shimmered gold, and people began disappearing. Experts speculated that the echoes weren't just creatures, but entities intelligent, ancient, and interdimensional. They existed in the spaces between worlds, and they were expanding their reach, using water as their gateway. The final message came from Mark himself, appearing on live television during a news broadcast. His image flickered into view, interrupting the program. His eyes burned with golden light, and his voice carried an otherworldly resonance. "The time has come," he said, his expression unreadable. "You open the door, now you must see what lies beyond." And then the broadcast ended. No one knows what happened to Mark or the countless others who vanished. The coastlines remain abandoned, the waters shimmering faintly in the moonlight. Some say the echoes have retreated, satisfied with what they've taken. Others believe they're still here, waiting, watching, biding their time. But one thing is certain, the whispers never stopped. And those who hear them find it impossible to resist. Because some doors, once opened, can never be closed.